at Center of Excellence in Artificial Intelligence and Center for Education Technology, IIT Kharagpur. His general area of interest is data science and, in particular, deep learning architectures, natural language processing, big data, and search engines. He published his research in top-tier venues such as ACM TOIS, ACM TIST, ACM SIGIR, among others, and has got awards from Google USA and ACM ICTIR for his contribution in research. Sir is an assistant professor, grade 1 in Center of Excellence in AI, IIT Kharagpur. Now I will request Sir to start the session.
Okay, so I hope you can see me and also you can hear me. Thanks for the introduction. So what I'm going to do today is to tell you the fundamentals of deep neural network, and in particular feed-forward neural network. And so I would like to do the things ground up, right from the basics. Some of you may find some of the things useful, and some of you may find some of the things are already known to you. So because I am targeting the general audience, so I have to cover the parts in as much detail as possible. So I'm sharing my screen. So the general sort of strategy for this is that I will be presenting things into segments. So once I cover one segment, then I will request you to raise any question you have on that segment, because otherwise you may forget everything by the time I end the entire presentation. So that is how I will proceed, and then I will try to respond to the best of my abilities. So okay. I hope you can see my slides. If someone can confirm.
Yes, yes.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Okay. So essentially, I would like to talk about the most fundamental deep neural network, which is deep feed-forward neural network. And so I will start with the motivation. So the motivation for this is this, and I would like to start with this particular example, and very simple example. And most of you probably know that the deep neural network is a very good sort of technique for supervised learning. What do I mean by supervised learning? That you have the label data, so generally the feature vectors and the target label, so labeled manually by some experts or some from other sources and things like that. And your objective is to sort of classify this data. So you are given a set of training examples, and from the training examples, you want to learn a function. So machine learning is all about playing with the functions, mathematical functions that you want to learn, which will take the input features and produce the output value. So once you figure out the function from the training data, then when a new data comes in without the labels, output labels, you only have the features. You want to predict what would be the most possible level for that particular example. So that is the typical setup for the supervised learning. And for this particular talk, I will assume that all the samples will have the same number of features. So they are on the fixed dimensional vector space. So let's consider this example, and I use this example to motivate why we need deep learning and how it can actually do complicated processing. So this is an example for movie recommendation. Okay, for example, there are two people, John and Mary, and you have prior data telling which movies they have liked and which movies they have disliked. Okay, so as you can see, there are two features: movie name, three features: movie name, then Mary's rating, then John's rating, and finally the target label, whether somebody has liked it or not, yes or no, things like that. Okay, so this is basically the training data setup. Now a new movie comes in, okay, and given your friends sort of data about this movie, you want to decide whether you want to watch this movie or not. So in a sense, yes or no. So based on this data, you want to predict whether this is going to be yes or this is going to be no. That's what you really want to learn. So if it is yes, then you want to see the movie. If it is no, you don't want to see the movie. So that's what you want to do. So this is a classic example of supervised learning task. Now, let's see how this particular problem can be solved using standard techniques, very standard technique that we know. Now, if I plot this data, my data looks like this. So I have two features, John's dating and Mary's dating is a two-dimensional vector space. And then I have two labels. The red ones telling that you liked it, and the cross ones, the green ones are telling that you disliked it. And the square one is the new movie. And for this, you have to say whether it belongs to the cross category or it belongs to the red circle category. Okay, that's what we essentially want to do. Now, given this problem, a simple solution in supervised learning is that you basically can draw a straight line, the green straight line, and then you can basically, that straight line will separate out the cross ones from the red circle ones. And once you know this green line, then whenever a new data comes in, you can see in which side of the straight line the new data is falling. And depending upon that, you can say whether this is yes or this is no. So in this case, if you somehow can find out the green line, then you can say for the new movie, the square one, this is going to be dislike category. Okay. So all our goal, given the data, that we want to figure out this particular straight line, the green straight line. Okay, that's the simplest possible example of supervised learning. Now, how can you predict this level for new movie? The new movie called Gravity. How could you do that? Okay, so once you have the straight line, then the possible answer could be logistic regression. As you know, logistic regression is a good classifier for binary classification tasks and also for simple things. When you have very complex problem, the decision boundary is non-linear, not linear, then logistic regression is not going to be good. But in this case, assuming that the decision boundary is linear, so you can use logistic regression, and it is a binary classification problem. So let's look at the logistic regression from graphically. So what does it do? So you have the input values. So there are two features, x1 and x2, and you have the corresponding weights, w1 and w2. So you basically combine these weights and then you into a thing called activation function. Okay, and finally you get the output. So in this particular example, the w1 is the weight for the feature x1, w2 is the weight for the feature x2, and b is called the bias. So now the z value is basically some linear combination of all these values. Okay. Now the function f, which is the activation function in this case, is sigmoid function, is going to take the z value, and it is going to give a scalar value between 0 and 1. So 1 means it is positive, 0 means it is negative. Then 1 means in one class, 0 means in another class. So that is how we basically can solve using this logistic regression problem. So if you look at this particular example, so say this straight line, which is represented by z in my case. So for this particular example, the value will be positive because this is falling on the right side of the straight line. So if it is right side of the straight line, then the value will be positive. For this particular example, it is greater than 0, actually 0.5 in this case, because this is greater than 0. So as a result, e to the power z by 1 plus e to the power z is going to be higher than 0.5. So when your logistic regression is telling that value is greater than 0.5, you can say is positive plus, otherwise it is in negative plus. Okay. Now, so far so good. Now, this you could do when you have, so this particular example, this you could do when you have the linear boundary. For example, using only one straight line, you can separate one class from the another class. Okay, you can use very simple things like logistic regression. But in reality, data, most of the real life data are not like that. Okay, so here is an example. Now consider this particular example. Similar problem that we have considered before. Now again, we have the two categories, red and the greens, like and dislikes. But if you plot somehow, I mean, for some data, if you plot this, it looks like this. Okay. Now there is no way you can separate the two classes, the reds and the greens one, using only straight line. You cannot find a single straight line which will separate these two classes. Okay. So what should you do then? Then a possible solution is you use two state lines to do this. So one state line is something like this. Two parallel state line you can draw, and this two state line, then you can basically separate out the two classes. So essentially what you have to do, you have to combine the decisions from multiple state line. Okay. So if it is below on the left side of the black state line, then in one class. If it is right side of the maroon state line, then it is another class. And if it is in the middle, then this is another class. Okay. So you have to combine the information from these two state line. Okay. Now simple way to do that is basically you have to consider two logistic regression curve for this one. One state line for one logistic regression curve, and then you can basically combine this information. So if we consider this, then it should look like this. So this is my sort of the data. So it's a non-linear data because you cannot separate out using a single state line. So then the question is, what could be the corresponding good neural network for this one? And I use this example just to tell you what's the role of the hidden nodes in neural network, how these hidden nodes are going to help you in taking critical decision in a very complex situation. That's my purpose. Okay. Now think about it. Now in this case, what you can see is that these two state lines can actually be modeled in a single neural network. So if you look at this, for example, I am telling that this particular, the first hidden node on the top is modeling one state line, the black one. And the second hidden node is actually modeling the another state line, the red one. Okay. Now, finally, in order to take the final decision, I have to combine the information from these two nodes. So finally, I have one more node, which you can see in this case, this particular node. In this particular node, you are extracting this information from the previous two nodes, this node and this node. Okay. And then finally, you get the output. The shaded nodes, this node and this node, these two nodes are called the hidden nodes. So essentially what they are doing, they are helping you to take decision in a complex situation. Okay. Because you can no longer solve this problem using a single hidden node. Okay. So more hidden nodes that you add or more hidden layers that you add in this case, you are going to model more nonlinear decision boundaries. Okay, and there is a theorem that people have proved that using neural network you can approximate any kind of continuous boundaries. Okay, so that's basically the role of the hidden nodes in any neural network. Now, moral of the story is that more hidden nodes you take, more complex decision you are going to make. By complex decision, what I mean is that the decision boundary, or if I ask you to draw a line or curve to separate out the different classes, then the curve is going to be highly nonlinear. So highly nonlinear it is, more complex it is. And that's it. And hidden node is basically going to help you on that. So that's exactly the thing that I'm talking about. The more hidden layers that you can take, more complex decision boundary you can model, and so on. And this is the case also for the number of nodes that you take in any situation. Okay. Now this is sort of the motivation. But when things are like very, very large, for example, if a neural network with say hundreds of layers with thousands of nodes in every layer, okay, you cannot probably visualize what is happening inside. Okay, and you shouldn't try actually to visualize because it's very difficult to visualize a very complex network. So this particular example just to give you an overview of what the roles of different hidden nodes. Now, what's the structure of a deep neural network? Okay, what are the things that you have to consider? So typically, I mean, given a particular problem, okay, what you finally want to do, you have to come up with a particular neural network architecture. And then you want to find out the parameters and you want to train it and predict and things like that. So the structure, you have mainly three kinds of things in this. You have one input layer. You have one or more hidden layers. And you have one output layer. Okay. So in this case, given a particular problem, Okay, you do not have to think too much to figure out the number of nodes in the input layer. This is predetermined. Okay, you have nothing to do in this case. It is typically the number of features that you have in the data. So if your data has 3 features, there are going to be 3 nodes in the input layer. Similarly, for the output one, the number of nodes is typically equals to the number of classes in your data. So for example, there are 2 classes, the number of nodes are 2. If there are 3 classes, then the number of nodes are 3, and so on. So given a problem, this is absolutely deterministic. Okay, you can very easily figure out what is the number of input nodes in the input layer and what would be the number of output nodes in the output layer. The only thing where the expertise, guidance, and experience will come into picture is the number of hidden layers and number of nodes in each of these hidden layers. Okay, and there are lots of issues that will come into picture when you design this particular network. There is no clear-cut theory on it. There are certain guidelines which I will talk about in a moment. So this is typically done. The hidden layers and hidden nodes typically done based on experimental setup. I mean, you do some experiments on the data. You see how the results are actually changing, and depending upon that, you can basically do these things. But the general guidelines is, if you can achieve very high accuracy using only one hidden layer, then you should not use more hidden layers. Okay, so ultimate objective is to make network less complex, simple, less complex in the sense that the number of parameters should be very small. Okay, so that is sort of the general structure of any deep feed forward neural network. Okay, so input layer is taking basically the feature values, and it is going through multiple transformation, and finally you get the value in the output layer. You will see in a moment how you can compute these things when I will show you an example. Okay, now as a designer, okay, you really want to be interested in the different ingredients. There are lots of theories. Theories helps, but doesn't help too much. So you need to know what are the ingredients of a deep neural network, what you need to know in order to design the actual network when you encounter a problem that you want to solve. And that's what you really are interested in. So first of all, given any neural network, okay, the first thing that you have to basically consider the weights, the weight parameters. Okay, so there are weight parameters, and the weight parameters is basically the strength of this basically lines, this line, this line, this line, and so on. Okay, so every connection has some weight, and that I denote by this particular quantity, WLIJ. It means connection weight of node I to node J from layer L to layer L plus 1. Okay, for example, this will be W211, because this particular weight is connecting node 1 to the node 1, the next layer, node 1 from layer 2 to node 1 from layer 3. And that's why I'm basically using W211. Okay. Similarly, for every non-input node, by non-input node, what I means, all the nodes in this case, in this particular layer, in this particular layer, in this particular layer, these are all non-input nodes. For all non-input nodes, you have a quantity or parameter called bias. So for all the Wijs and bias, they're basically scalar quantity. They're simply scalar values. Okay. So basically, you have the weights connecting one node to another node. You have the bias, how good the corresponding network neuron would be, what its usefulness. The bias will determine that. And the final thing that you have is called the activation function. So when you are getting values in this, so this is your input value coming into this particular node. Okay. Now this node is taking some input value. This particular node takes some input value, and then you are actually determining to what extent my input value is good or bad. If the signal is good, then your node is going to say this is good. your signal that is receiving is bad, then you're going to say this is bad. So I have to determine that based on something, some information. So here is basically the activation function. Okay, and which is this one? So one such classic example of activation function is a logistic regression function. So we take some value, the scalar value, and give some another value between 0 and 1. There are lots of activation functions that people use, and I will show in a moment what are the different kinds of activation function. Okay. So these are the three things, three main ingredients of a deep neural network. Now, what a non-input node of the neural network does. Okay. So by non-input node, I mean the shaded nodes in this case, shaded nodes and the other nodes. I mean, except the nodes in the very first layer. So what they do, they take some information. For example, in this case, if you consider this particular node, so it is taking some information from the previous layer. Now look at this. This particular node is actually taking information from all the nodes in the previous layer. Okay, all the nodes in the previous layer. So what it is actually doing, it is taking all the information from these nodes, okay, in the previous layer, then linearly combines them, and then it passes through an activation function telling to what extent my information good or bad. If it is very low value, then it is bad. If it is very high value, this is good. And it is finally giving some value from this particular node. Similarly, you are getting some information from this also in this particular node. It is giving some value in this. So there are two input values coming into this node. It is also combining linearly. Finally, you are getting the output value. Okay. Now, if we see the actual computation, then what it does is that it is nothing but the linear combination of the input value from the previous nodes plus the bias. So, for example, input to this node is this. So W2 into X1, then W4 into X2 plus the bias of this node. So this is basically the input to this node. Okay. Now the output from this node is going to be the activation function, in this case, which is f, the activation function f of the input value. Okay. So if this is typically, if this is very high value, then f is going to be also high and things like this. Okay. So this is going to say that whether my signal that I'm receiving in a node is good or bad. If it is good, then it will fall in one side of this curve. If it is bad, then it will fall another side of this curve, things like that. So when neural network started, and this is, by the way, this is not this is not a new technology. Okay, it is very old technology actually. So when it started off, then people actually started off with a shallow neural network, only one hidden layer. So this is no longer the case because with the available computing powers and new algorithms, people no longer use shallow neural network. So in shallow neural network, what you have only one hidden layer and with many nodes in it. On the contrary, in deep neural network, what you have many deep network, many hidden layers, and every hidden layer will have some number of nodes. That's the distinction between this. One versus many, and that's the essential thing. Now, if you look at this particular deep neural network architecture, so it is actually modeling 8-dimensional features because there are 8 nodes in the input layer. Similarly, it is actually modeling 4 class because there are 4 nodes in the output layer. Okay, this is pretty deterministic. But what is not deterministic is the inside of this network, the number of hidden layers and the number of nodes and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, so far so good. So I would like to take a pause and then ask you if you have any question or doubt on this, because the training is going to be so little heavy. So before that, I have to make sure that you and I are on the same page. If you have any question, then I'd be happy to answer.
Sir, I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Sir, in case of multiple hidden layer, you have suppose more than 2-3 different hidden layers are there.
Right.
So number of nodes in every layer with another layer is equal or different, or it is any relationship there?
Okay, so see, there are as such no clear-cut sort of deterministic rule for this one. So what people typically do, people actually take the number, just to simplify the whole thing, the number of nodes to be equal generally. Okay, and some people also say that as you increase the number of layers, then you should decrease the number of nodes in this. But as such, there is no clear-cut guidelines. Okay, now one way to mitigate this is this, that what you can do, you can take the same number of nodes in every hidden layer, okay, however large it is, and once you are done with the training, then you can actually look at the output from each of these nodes, okay. And if the output values, for example, the bias or these, they are basically very small, then you can say they are not contributing too much in my decision making. So you can finally, you can altogether ignore these particular nodes and prune your network. So in that way, you can prune this. There are pruning techniques that you can apply to compress the network a little bit by removing the nodes which are not doing much in helping taking the decision. Okay, any other question? Okay, all right. So, so the thing is basically a neural network is a very complex model. Complex in the sense that, complex in the sense I'm not trying to mean the complex means the conceptual complexity that is difficult to understand. That is not the case probably. By complexity, what I mean is that the the number of parameters that a model has is very, very large. As I have pointed out, that machine learning model is nothing but a function approximation. What you finally get is basically a mathematical function on a very high dimensional space. And building model is not a great thing to do. You can come up with a very complex model, very complex function, and so on. But all model will have a certain number of parameters, the model parameters. Now, you can introduce very complex model by introducing too many parameters. But ultimately, in order to make things practical or useful, you have to figure out the good values of these parameters. So unless you do not know the parameter values, for example, in our case, the Wijs and Bijs, the biases and the weights, if you do not have the values, the numerical values for those parameters, you are not going to get anything from any model. So in that sense, although neural network is very powerful model, but it is also very complex. And so ultimately, we have to find out the good values of these parameters, the weights and the biases, by using the training data that you have. Okay? So the next segment, I'm going to talk about what are the different techniques and tools that is available which can help you train neural network as faithfully as possible from the training data. Okay, so let me just quickly start off with the gradient descent. And I'm telling you because this is the fundamental algorithm. This is the only known and the most important algorithm for training deep neural network. There is no other algorithm as efficient, as useful as this particular one. So I'd like to spend some time on this particular thing. And if you have any question, you can ask me at the end of the segment. So let's start with the gradient descent. And this is the technique that we use to find these parameter values. So just a quick review of differential calculus. So if you have univariate function, for example, y is equal to fx, then if I ask you to find out the maximum or minimum value of this function, then you can simply take the derivative of that with respect to the variable equate to 0 and then find out what values of x this is going to be 0. And that way you can find the maximum or minimum value. Now, why this is relevant and how this is relevant in our case in neural network? Ultimately, in a model in neural network, you are going to construct an error function. I will show in a moment what would be the nature of the error function. So you're going to construct the error function, and then how you can find these values of these parameters the weights and the biases so that you have the minimum value for this error function. So essentially, you are going to minimize a function. Okay. So and so because this is a multivariate function, we have to use multivariate calculus for that. But I just quickly recap the differential calculus on univariate case. So this is from the 10+2 level mathematics. So you can equate this to 0 and then find out the values of x for which these values will be maximum or minimum. Now, what happens when you have multivariate situation? That function involving multiple variables in this case. So instead of taking a complete derivative, now you have to take the partial derivative. So because there are 3 variables in this case, x, y, x, z, and w. So you can take del y, del x partial derivative with respect to x, z, and w. And then you can separately equate them to 0 and find out for what values of x, z, and w your function will have maximum or minimum value. Okay, the same technique as the previous one, but only thing that you are going to play with the partial derivative instead of total derivative. So the question is then, okay, now one more concept is local versus global minima. Now, when you are dealing with very complex function, you cannot guarantee there is only one minimum. There can be multiple, like, local minimum. So in this picture, you can say that there's a local minima, as you can see clearly. Okay, there's an inflection point, and there's a global minima. Although our objective is to find out the global minima, this is always not the case, and this is very difficult to do in a very high dimensional space. Okay, so we may ultimately need to be very happy with the local minima as well. Okay. Now let's talk about the gradient descent. And this is actually a very, very simple algorithm. There is nothing complex in it. Just 10+2 mathematics calculus will be enough. Okay. So what the purpose of gradient descent? And as the name suggests, the gradient or the slope will be descending. Okay. So the goal essentially is that we want to find the minimum value of a function with respect to the parameters that the function contains. For example, if you look at this particular example, what you can see is that f is my model, this f, and this is my input data. Okay, so fi is basically the predicted level for the example xi given by the function f or the model f, and wi is basically the level from your training set, which is the gold standard. Okay. Now, if you have m such, the number of samples in your training data is m, then you can simply take the squared loss and then take a sum over it. So this is basically the function E is basically the total error committed by a function f or a model f. Okay. Now, the function f is basically it has multiple parameters, okay, say w1, w2, and so on and so forth. So what we have to ultimately do, for what values of w1, w2, and w3, my E value will be minimum. I simply want to minimize, and I have to find out for what values of w1, w2, and wn, my E value is minimum. So all I have to do, that I have to basically apply the gradient descent. That I will take the partial derivative with respect to all this, equate to 0, and things like this. Okay. Now, the gradient descent is looks like this is a graphical demonstration. It's very easy to do. Now look at this particular example very carefully. Okay, that's a very simple idea, and I think this should be enough for you to understand the main role or the intuition behind gradient descent. Now say this is my car, the function that I have. Okay, and the black spot is the one where you want to reach. Okay, that's my ultimate goal. That's the global minimum that you want to reach. So I have to start from somewhere. Okay, so assume that the red point is the place where I want to start. Okay, now red is my starting point, and which you can basically choose randomly. Okay, by initializing a random value. Now the question is, given the starting point, I want to reach to the black spot. So in which direction I should move and how I should move? That's my question next. Okay. Now, how can I determine the direction? The simple is basically downward direction I have to move because my destination is at the bottom. Okay, that's all right. Now, how can you know from that point that I have to go downward? Now, you can simply look at the derivative at that point, at the red point. So if you look at the derivative at this point, in this particular point, you can take the derivative of this point, and by look at the sign of this derivative, okay, you can know whether I have to go upward or I have to go downward. So what's the sign of the derivative in this case at this point? This is actually positive. Okay, so if it is positive, so if you go towards right or up, then value will increase. Okay, so I have to go backward, that means downward. So then I have to basically move to opposite to that direction, which is basically minus of that. Okay, so if I do that, then I will reach the destination. So therefore, how can I basically change the parameters to reach the minimum value? So I have the initial value, which is theta old. Theta is my parameter value. Theta old is the initial value, randomly initialized. And this minus sign with this one is telling me in which direction I should move. Okay, this is telling me which direction I should move. And then you have another thing is called R, which is basically the rate constant. That means at what rate you should descend. If R value is very large, then you will descend very fast. If R value is very small, then you are descending with a very small rate. Okay, but essentially the derivative, this one, is actually guiding you the direction of movement, and the R value is basically guiding you the speed of movement. Okay, so you can apply this formula to find out the next best guess for theta nu, and you can iterate over and over again to find out these things. So just to sort of give a little bit of more illustration. So first this, okay, so let's see what happens. So this is the destination where we want to reach. So this is my starting position. So when you first apply this update rule, you may be somewhere here. Okay, now again you know from the derivative sign that you have to go downward. So in the next update you are somewhere here. In the next update you are somewhere here. Sorry. So in this way you can basically go down and until and unless you reach the destination. So this is from the one side. Now what happens from this side? So this is again, in this case you start from this side. So in this case the derivative will be negative, right? Because you have the negative slope. So you have to move to opposite to that direction. That means a positive direction. So you basically go in this direction on the right side, this direction, and so on and so forth. So finally, if you do that, and if you iteratively update the values, then you will reach the destination where you really want to reach, which is the black spot. Okay. So this is the simple demonstration of gradient descent, and this is true for any kind of smooth function. Remember that we are not dealing with non-continuous function. We're dealing with the continuous function. That means the function is very smooth. So whenever you have a function, error function is smooth function, then you can use gradient descent algorithm to find out the minimum value. Now, so this way you can basically go down and finally reach the destination. Now, so what happens for the gradient descent for the multivariate function? So if you look at this, and because we will be dealing with the multivariate function, that this is an example of multivariate function. Okay, because you have the parameters here. So there are n features, x1, x2 up to xn, n feature values. These are known values, feature values. And this theta 1, theta 0, theta 1, theta 2, and theta n. These are basically the parameters, the model parameters. And all my objective in this case, the gradient descent, is to figure out the values of these parameters. Only then you can actually compute the class level, the value of y. So as I pointed out, that one possible error function could be this. Okay, this is the predicted by your model, and this is coming from your training database, the gold standard. So you want to minimize this difference. Okay, that's the error function. So the gradient descent update rule for this case, because there are how many parameters? There are n plus 1 parameters. Okay, because theta 0 up to theta n. So in this case, there will be n plus one such equation. Okay, in this case. So for every theta, you have one such equation. So this is basically partial derivative. In this case, this is the partial derivative we have. And so in this case, you have n plus one such equation. So that means if your function or the error function has n parameters, then you will have n such object equations, the gradient descent rules. Okay. Okay, all right. Now, what's the algorithm then? Remember that as I told you that when you want to descend, I have to find the minimum value. For example, in this case, the black spot. So you have to choose a starting point. Okay, the red one, for example. It could be anywhere. It depends on you where you want to start. There is no such clear-cut like methodology to start. So starting point is basically the randomly chosen values. Okay. So for example, if you have say 3 parameters, say theta 1, theta 2, and theta 3 in a model, then all the parameter values will be chosen randomly. Say for example, this is 0.01, this is 0.03, and this is 0.04, things like this. Okay. So you choose randomly. Okay. So that gives you the starting position where you want to start. Then in which direction you want to move, upward or downward, that is going to determine the partial derivatives. Okay. So then what you can do, you can repeat until convergence. What you can do, you can basically apply the same gradient descent rule. Okay. Again and again and again repeatedly, because you want to really reach this black spot. So you have to iterate multiple times for all parameters. Okay. So the biggest question in this case, when to stop? That's all right. I have to repeat. I know I have to repeat in order to get the black spot, in order to reach the black spot. But then when I should stop? Okay, there are 2 possible ways to stop. One possible way is basically either you stop after fixed number of iteration, that you decide that, oh, okay, I will stop after 1000 iteration. Okay. Or the other possibility would be when you are seeing that there is not much change in the parameter values. For example, when you are here, so essentially you are coming down, right, following this path. So if you start from here, then you make here in the next step, then you here, then you here, then you here, and things like this. So moment you are here, okay, then in the next step you can find you are here. So if you see the changes are very small, there is not much change in the values. Okay, that means you have reached in this position. Okay, the bottommost position. It could be global minima, it could be local minima. But the moment you are at the inflection point, the point where the curve is actually taking the other direction, then you will have the very little changes in the parameter values. So you can stop then as well. Now, the method that I talked about in this case, this is called batch gradient descent. That means you have an error function involving all the training samples in your data. Okay, so you compute error on all the training samples, combine them, and then apply. Now this is inefficient because every time you are going to consider everything, so computationally inefficient. So the simplest solution is basically stochastic gradient descent. It's called stochastic gradient descent. So what does it do? That so in previous case, in which direction you should move depends on all the training samples. So if you have 1 million training samples in your data, you are going to use all the training samples, which is expensive. Okay. Now in stochastic gradient descent, you don't want to use all the training samples. What you want to do, you want to use a single training sample. Single training samples at a time. The single training sample is going to tell you in which direction you should move. Okay. So the gradient that you are going to compute, you are going to compute that using a single sample. So here is an algorithm. So now in this case, as you see, I do not have any summation in this case. Okay, I simply have one example, the ith example. So for ith example, this is the value given by my model. This is the gold standard value, and this is my error. Okay, so I'm going to minimize this one for individual samples. So what then I can do? In this case, my gradient will be this, and this is a very straightforward computation. You can just take a look at it. You don't have to do it now, because one can do it very easily. So your gradient, if you simply do that partial derivative with respect to these values, then you can going to get this value. Okay. And so the algorithm is something like this. So again, we have to start from somewhere. So you want to initialize randomly all the values. Okay. Then the next step, you want to randomly shuffle all the training samples. Okay. So if you have 100 samples, 100 data in your training data, then you randomly shuffle it just to reduce the bias. Then what you could do, you until and unless you reach the convergence point or you want to stop, you take the individual samples. Sample number 1, you take, then perform this computation. Okay, then you have some values for thetas, then use that value and take the sample number 2, then compute this one. Then you are basically doing this. So unlike the previous case, where we are actually doing this computation only once over all the data, in this case, we're actually doing this for the individual samples. Okay, and that way you can basically proceed. The convergence criterion is the same. Either you can stop after fixed number of iteration, or you can stop when see there is no change. Okay. Now if you can recall what I have said is that the gradient descent is the main technique that you have to use. Now the problem with the batch gradient descent, where you are using everything, is computationally expensive. Now the other extreme is basically using a single sample. So single sample may not give you the appropriate direction where you have to move. So for example, one sample may say that you have to move upward. The next sample may say you have to move downward. That also may happen because you are taking the individual opinion, right? There are many kinds of samples. You are taking the individual opinion. So there could be some problem. So the mini batch stochastic gradient descent, the same technique, but it lies somewhere between taking all and taking one. Okay. So what it does, instead of computing gradient using all samples or one sample, it computes the gradient using B training sample. B could be a small number, say 100 or 200 or things like that. Okay, or even 10. So you choose 10 samples from the data, use all the 10 samples to compute the direction or to determine the direction, and then basically update your parameters. So this is the algorithm. Again, the initialization setup is very same. You randomly initialize the values. Then you have to set the value of B, which is the batch size. That means how many samples you are going to take to guide your direction. Okay. Then again, you randomly shuffle the training samples, which you have done in the previous case. So this is the algorithm. If you look at this algorithm, is that, so repeat until convergence. This is the same thing that we have, the same criteria that we have. Now you are going to form multiple mini batch in this step. So take one batch, okay, and then basically compute this one. Okay, it's the same old computation that we have. Okay, take one batch, compute all the parameter values. So you have new set of values. Then take the next batch, update the values. Then take the next batch, update the values, and so on and so forth, until and unless you reach the point of convergence. Okay, so this is in the middle of the taking all the samples and taking one sample. Okay, and this particular method, the mini batch stochastic gradient descent, is the one that is actually used in almost all deep learning setup nowadays, be it TensorFlow, be it Keras, be it PyTorch, and everything, everywhere it is used. Okay, so this is the one that you should be used in practical situation. So batch size is typically 10 to 200, but there is no sort of concrete guidelines. It could vary depending upon the problem complexity, depending upon the number of features, depending upon the amount of training data that you have, and so on and so forth. Okay, so these are some of the guidelines, but not a definitive thing. Okay, so let me summarize the gradient descent algorithm. So you have three different types of gradient descent. Batch, where you have all the training samples, you are using all the training samples to know the direction. Then you have stochastic gradient descent, where you are using only one training sample And you have the mini batch gradient descent, where you are taking a batch of samples, small number of samples. Okay, you form the batches of say 10, 20 or whatever, and then you use this as a guide to determine the direction in which you want to move. Okay. Okay. Now, just a quick sort of add on in this, that what are the limitations of gradient descent? Now, if you look at this particular example carefully, now what happens is that, now let me just draw this picture. Okay, say I have this curve. Okay, and this is my destination, and say this is my starting point. Okay, now you use this update rule again and again, and as you know, you have this thing called R, the learning rate constant. It is telling how fast you want to descend. Okay, so R is, for example, very big. Say if R is equals to say 10, then after this maybe you are here. Okay, now if R is equals to say, for example, 1, then after this you may be here. So depending upon the value of R, it will basically tell you where you should go next and how fast. Now the problem is this, that say you are basically descending at some rate at this position, and then this position, this position, this position, this position, and so on. Okay, and somewhere you have here, for example, not exactly at the destination point, but very close to this, in this position. Now, if the R value is very big, say for example 100 or things like this, then what will happen? Because of this formula, in the next step, you will come somewhere here. So you'll overshoot the destination and jump here. Okay. Now, the moment you are here, you know the gradient here is negative. So you have to basically move in the opposite direction. So again, from here, it will go in this direction. So again, you are here. So again, it will compute that gradient is positive. So you have to move in the opposite direction. So from again, it will basically do the same thing. And so if the R is very big, just near the point of convergence or the lowest value, you may start oscillating left and right, left and right, left and right. Okay. So as a result, you may not get good values. Okay. So therefore, a desirable thing is that R should be small. So if R is small, then this situation will not arise. Okay, so you can probably start this point at some point of time. But there is one problem with small value of R. What's the problem? The problem is that you are descending very, very slowly. Now, if you have a very complex network with millions and millions of parameters and millions of training samples, okay, small value of R could be a very slow process because you are slowly moving, very slowly moving. So the general guideline in this case is that when you are starting, okay, starting off, then keep the value of R to a big value. And as you are basically doing the iteration over and over again, as you are moving further, then you gradually decrease the value of R. Okay, so that you don't encounter the situation that we have seen in this case. Of course, there are other solutions as well. So one solution is basically you can set the learning rate different for different parameters. Okay, and you can adjust this learning rate. So in the previous case, we had a learning rate. The R value is constant, irrespective of where you are. But what you have to do, you have to make this adaptive in the sense that, okay, it should be adaptive to the parameters, it should be adaptive to where it is, and so on and so forth. So one such algorithm is called ADA-GRAD algorithm. Now in this case, what you see, you have roughly the same thing. The only new thing that you have in this case is this one. This quantity. Okay? Square root of GIT plus epsilon. This is the only new thing that you see in this case. Okay. Now you can keep R values very high value. That's not a problem. But this, the GT is basically, it is collecting information from the previous gradients. So it depends on the previous gradients that you have computed. Okay. If the previous gradient is very high, this is going to be very high. If it is low, it is low, and so on. So in this way, basically you can adjust this value and make the learning rate adjustable. Okay. Keep the R constant. But as you move, the GI values depends on the iteration. So this is going to adjust the whole learning rate in this case. Okay, so this can mitigate some of the problems that you encounter in standard gradient descent. Okay, so I like to take a pause and take a couple of questions. If you have any, try to clarify your doubts or anything. So any question? Okay, it seems that you have no question. All right. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do.
Sir,
Yeah,
one
yes,
question
please.
is posted in the chat box.
Oh, chat box you have posted on question. Okay, all right. Let me just see it. Chat box. Okay, so this is okay. Let me just repeat the question. The question is, so Antorapal, right? Antorapal asked this question. So the question is, if I get any local minima in the card before getting the global minima, which is the ultimate destination, then how should I proceed? Okay, so see, you do not know which one is the local minima and which one is the global minima. There is no way you can know because you are dealing with too many parameters. Okay, so all you want to do that you want to run your algorithm multiple times with multiple starting positions. You remember that the starting position that you are determining is based on randomly chosen values. So you can run your algorithm with different setup by changing the learning rate, by initializing different values and so on and so forth, and run multiple times your same algorithm. Now, if you run 10 times the algorithm, and every time you are computing, ultimately you are computing the value of the objective function or the cost function, right? So for 10 different situations, you have 10 cost function values, and you simply look at which one is the minimum value. Okay, which one is the minimum value, and for that, which are the parameter combinations, and you simply take that as a thing. Okay. Okay, any other question? All right. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is, so I would like to tell you, and this is, by the way, this is by far the most important piece of technique in any deep neural network. So if you understand this algorithm or the method, then you probably understand, I would say 70% of the main thing in deep neural networks. So anything that you do, so be it the feed-forward neural network, be it the convolutional neural network, be it the recurrent neural network. So everything that you do, we have to do it using this particular algorithm, which is called back propagation algorithm. Okay. And often people found this difficult to understand, but I think this is not difficult because it essentially stands upon a very simple calculus, simply the chain rule of calculus. Okay. So I'm going to show, or rather I'm going to work out a back propagation algorithm with a very simple network. And then I will move on to the complex network if time permits. Okay. So let me tell you the purpose of back propagation algorithm. Now, when you have a very complex network or a deep neural network, that means you have many, many parameters. Ultimately, you have to find out the values of these parameters, the W's and B's and so on, the biases and the weights and so on. Okay. And you find these values based on the training data that you have. Somebody has given you the training data, with the features and the target levels. And you simply use those training data to find out the good values of parameters. But this is not an easy task to do. Okay. So how to do it? Now you can basically randomly initialize some values of these parameters. Then you can check how your model is performing, how close it is to the actual values or the gold standard values, compute the error function. And then you can basically apply the gradient descent. You want to minimize this error function, you want to apply the gradient descent, okay, which you have shown. So gradient descent means the main thing that you read in gradient descent, you have to compute the partial derivatives of all these parameters. That is the only thing you have to do. Okay. Now, because the network is a very complex, there are too many parameters, too many combinations, you cannot compute the derivatives very, very easily. You need to have a very efficient algorithm to do that. Okay, if it is not efficient, then it is going to take infinite amount of time. So purpose of backpropagation algorithm is simply, and it is simply to compute the values of these partial derivatives efficiently. And that is the only and sole purpose for backpropagation algorithm. There is no other purpose. Okay, and it is used in all kinds of deep neural network, be it RNN, be it CNN, be it transformer network, be it anything else, and so on and so forth. Everywhere you have to use these things. So in that sense, it's the most important algorithm that one needs to know when somebody is working with or at least trying to learn deep learning. Okay. So with this note, let me start the discussion on this one. Okay. Now I'm going to do the board. I'm going to write the whole thing on the screen, and you can follow it. If you have a question, you can stop me. Okay. Now let's say we start with this very simple example. So we have a data with one feature and two class. Okay. It's a very simple example we can consider. So one feature and two class. Now, my neural network could be something like this, that my feature value is X, there is single feature. Okay, so this is my input. There is only one node in the input because I have only one feature. And because there is only two class, so I can actually use single node to model two class, because if the value of this node is very high, then it is actually one class, and the value of this node is very low, then it's another class. So I can say, for example, this is my output value. Okay, this is my output node. Okay, now the input and output is basically determined based on your input data. Now I say that I am taking 3 hidden nodes. And basically 3 hidden layers with single nodes. Okay, and therefore, so I say this is the layer number 1. Sorry, this is the layer node number 1. This is node number 2. This is node number 3, and so on and so forth. Okay, and so on. So now what I really want to do, I really want to figure out, okay, so this is, for example, my output in this case. Okay, now what is the input to this node in this particular case? The input to this node, okay, let me just redraw this a little, and okay, let me just redraw this. Okay, now I have two, one feature and two class, one feature and two class, and so therefore I have this network X, and my output is here, and so I am going to take 2 hidden nodes inside this one. I just want to make it a little simple so that we can do the computation easily. Okay, so this is I'm telling this is node number 1, this is node number 2, and this is node number 3. Okay, so every node will have some input and some output, and every connection has some weight. So I assume that the weight for this connection is W1. I assume that the weight for this connection is W2. And I assume that the weight for this connection is W3. Okay. Then you also have the biases for the nodes. So bias for this node, say I'm saying this is B1. Bias for this node is B2. And bias for this node is B3. All right. And my output from this particular node is O3. So my network is taking some value called X and producing some value called O3, which is output 3. Okay. Now every node, non-input node, will have some value in it, some input in it and some output from it. So what's the input to this node number 1? And I denote this by I1. So I1 is equals to, I1 is equals to what? So I1 is equals to W1X plus B1. Why? The W1 multiplied the input value from the previous layer plus B1 is the bias of this. So what's the output from this? The output from this particular node number 1 is basically F of I1. Okay. So F of I1 means where F is the activation function. Remember, there is an activation function inside every non-input node. So this is the output. Similarly, for node number 2, the I2 is basically W2 into X plus B2, and O2 is basically F of I2. Oh, sorry. This is giving some kind of problem. Okay. Just on a moment, I think it's making some problem. Just discard this one. Okay, I just have to start over this again. I'm sorry. Okay, sorry. I just quickly start over this again. Okay, so what is happening in this case is this, that you have an input node X, you have a hidden node 1, you have another hidden layer 2, hidden node 2, and then 3, and then the output. Okay, and the input to this node number this is basically this is W1. This is W1. This is W2. This is W2, and this is W2, and this is W3, and so on and so forth. So I1 is basically W1X plus B1, which is the bias. O1 is basically F of I1. Similarly, I2 is basically W2X plus B2, and O2 is basically F of I2. Similarly, you have I3 is equals to W3X plus B3, and O3 is F of I3. Okay, so this is the sort of the kind of setup that we have. So you are getting some values from the previous layer, and finally you are doing the things. Now the question is, we have to now find out the good values of this W1, W2, W3, B1, B2, and B3. That we have basically to find out. Now the question is, how can I do that? So here is this simple sort of the example that I have again. So let me draw this again. X is node number 1, node number 2, node number 3, and this is O3. So now for this, first of all, I have to do what I have to do. This is B1, this is B2, and this is B3, W2, W3, and so on. So first of all, the first thing that I have to figure out is that my error function. Okay, because ultimately I have to find out what will be my error function. Okay. So what would be my error function in this case? So it would be something like half of this one, that something predicted by the network, which is O3, and then Y, which is basically the gold standard. Okay. So this is, I have to basically, this is my error function. So O3 is given by the network, this network, and Y is basically the gold standard from your data. Okay. Now, what I have to do, I have to now minimize E value. Minimize E value with respect to W1, W2, W3, B1, B2, and B3. Okay. Now, as you know, there are 6 parameters in this particular model. And because we have 6 parameters, then we basically have to apply the gradient descent for this one. Okay. And gradient descent we're going to find out using the backpropagation algorithm. Okay. Now let's see how we can actually compute the backpropagation algorithm. So my backpropagation algorithm is going to be like this. So I use this example again. Okay. Now I have my I1 and O1, I2 and O2, and I3 and O3. So every node will have some input and some output. Okay. So I1 is basically W1x plus B1. This is f of I1. I2 is W2 into f of I1 plus B2, and O2 is going to be f of I2, and I3 is going to be W3 into f of I2 plus B3, and O3 is basically f of I3. Okay. So this is my sort of the normal setup that I have. Okay. Now my performance function is this: E is equals to half of O3 minus Y whole square. Okay. Now I want to compute. So essentially, I have to compute the partial derivative with respect to all the parameters. Okay. Now, if I compute this del A and del W3, okay, that means the parameter associated with this one. This is the W3. This is W2, and this is W1. Okay. Now I have to compute this one. So what will happen is that, I can compute this way. See, now E depends on, the error function depends on O3, right? So if E depends on O3, so what I can write, that del E del O3. So I'm going to apply chain rule of derivative. So because E depends on O3. Now if you look at O3, O3 depends on this one, I3. So then it will be del O3 with respect to del I3. Okay. Now again the I3 depends on W3, because if you look at this particular expression, I3 depends on W3. So I3 is going to be, so this is again del I3 del W3. Okay. Now this is how you can compute the partial derivative for del E del W del partial differentiation of E with respect to W3. Okay. And because you know everything, like you know E function of E with respect to this, you know O3, you know del I3, then you can basically straightforward computation by which you can get the value of this one. Now what about this one, the del E del W2? So again, E depends on O3. So the same chain rule that we apply, del E del O3. Then O3 again depends on I3. So del O3 del I3. Then I3 depends on I2. Okay. So del I3 depends on this one. So basically you can apply del I3 depends on del, which is basically the output of this one, del O2, into del O2 depends on del I2, and then del I2 depends on del I2 depends on del W2. So look at this, the parameter W2 associated in this particular connection in this case. So all the way, starting from this one, all the way you have to come all the way up to this one. So from here to up to this particular position you have to come, and then you stop. Okay. Now similarly, if you can apply, for example, del E and del W1, okay, you can similarly find out that you will have the del E, the same mechanism that you apply, del O3, then del O3, then del I3, then you have del I3, then del O2, then del O2 into del I2. Simply the functional dependency you can follow. Then del I2 divided by del O1, then del O1, del I1 into del I1 into del W1. So all you can do is that you can simply follow the dependencies. So O3, so when you are just following this computation, the simplest way to do it, E depends on O3, O3 depends on I2 or O2, then that depends on the previous layer, and so on. So in this way you can basically proceed until and unless you reach the corresponding connection. Okay. Now just to verify whether your computation is right or wrong, one thing you could do is this, that if you look at the W3, for example, so in W3, it is basically coming into this node and producing something output, and finally this output is used to compute the error. So there are three things. It is here, then from here to here, and then finally the error function. So there are three things, so three combination, 1, 2, 3. Similarly, if you take W2, so coming into this particular node, then output from this node, so 2, it is again coming into this node, 3, then it is coming out of this particular node, 4, and then finally error function. There are 5 components. Similarly, when you're computing W1, there will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 3, and there are 7 components because 2 for this one, 2 for this one, 2 for this one. There are 6 components, and finally you have 1 for the error function. Okay, just to verify that whether your computation is right or wrong, you can quickly do these things.
Sir, one thing, sir.
Yep.
Sir, why the corresponding bias is not considered here? We are
Sorry?
considering weight. We
Uh-huh.
are considering the corresponding weight.
Uh-huh.
But why we are not considering the corresponding bias value?
No, bias we have to do. Yeah, I mean just showing an illustration that how you can do for the weights, and bias in similar way you can do also bias. So you have to compute daily del B1, daily del B2, and so on and so forth. I mean similar kind of expression that you have to basically apply. So you have to do. Okay, I'm just showing how you can apply this backpropagation chain rule in order to compute the derivative.
Okay, sir.
You can apply the same analogy to compute the biases as well. There is no problem. Okay, okay, all right. Now, if you look at this expression carefully, what you notice is this, and that is why backpropagation is very, very powerful. Okay. Now I request you to consider. So there are some issues with my pen giving some trouble for some reason. So please ignore these strikeout lines. This is not strikeout lines. This is actual lines. So I will try to rectify all this, and when I will upload the slides. So why this backpropagation is so powerful when you're computing the derivatives? You could have other methods, for example, the normal chain rule, okay, using composition and so on and so forth. But why is backpropagation is so powerful? Now there is a nice symmetry between these equations. Now, if you look at this expression carefully, what you notice is this: that look at this expression carefully. Now look at del E, del W3, this one and this one. Okay. Now if you look at this part and this part, these two parts are common. Okay, that means when you are computing the derivative for this one, the W3, you can actually save these values, this component, and you can reuse these values while you are computing the derivative for W2, because then you do not have to recompute it again, because these are the same values. Okay. Similarly, if you look at del E and del W2 and del E del W1, then you can see even longer commonality. What is that? So this part is common with this part. Okay, these two parts are common. So there are 4 expressions which are common in del E del W2 and del E del W1. Okay, so therefore, when you are doing the computation, if you can save these values, so you can actually save lots of computation. Okay, you don't have to do, and that is why backpropagation is very fast algorithm for doing this. Okay. Now the question is, if I ask you to compute the derivative either with respect to W1, W2, and W3, which one you want to do first? Obviously, you want to do del E del W3 first. So when you are doing this thing, then you know that this particular expression is available to you. You have computed this one. So you can use a single variable to save this value. Next time, when you're computing del E del W2, you can actually reuse this value here. You don't have to compute this again. Okay? Now, when you're computing del E del W2, then you are computing the whole expression, this one, within the bigger rectangle. Okay? And because this part is also common with the part in
I think there is some problem in the network. Alok, please check.
এখানে তো ঠিক আছে।
So that is why this algorithm is called backpropagation. Okay, efficient computation by moving backward. Okay, so that is how we can basically compute the derivatives. So sole purpose of backpropagation is to compute the derivatives. Once you have the derivatives, then you can apply the gradient descent. That's the only component. So this is for the weights, and the similar thing you can do for the biases as well. Similar, basically, procedure you can apply. Okay. So I don't think I have much time. I will stop here, and then I would like to take a couple of questions if you have any on this. Okay, I have few guidelines for you. Okay, let me just wrap up the guidelines part, and then I will probably move. Okay, so few guidelines for designing and training neural network, and this is especially useful. Okay, one thing I would like to tell you is that backpropagation is now readily implemented, and this is important only when you really want to design your own network architectures. Then you have to know how you actually train it. Okay, otherwise for regular stuff, the TensorFlow library or the Keras library or the PyTorch library, you have everything available, all the APIs available for efficient backpropagation. Okay, now couple of things that I'd like to mention before I log off. So it is important that you know some design issues and training issues when you are actually trying to sort of design a neural network or trying to apply neural network on your problem. Okay, so I would like to give you some practical guidelines from my own experience of designing network and how you can use these things to actually speed up the training or to come up with a better network in terms of fighting overfitting and things like that. Okay, so as I pointed out, there are many things in a neural network. The first thing that I have to consider, given a problem, the setting the architectural parameters. Architectural parameters mean the number of nodes in the input layer, the number of nodes in the output layer, the number of hidden layers, and the number of nodes in hidden layers. So as I have pointed out, the number of nodes in input layer and the number of nodes in output layer, it's very, very easy to do because that is coming from your data, the number of features and the number of classes. Number of hidden layers, there is no guidelines. I mean, typically you choose empirically. You run experiments, you see how the performance is actually changing, and then depending upon that, you can fix it. Similarly, number of nodes in hidden layers also, you have to choose empirically. There is no concrete guidelines. You simply run, see how performance is actually changing. If it is bad, then you increase the number of hidden layers, increase the number of nodes in the hidden layers, and then see whether it is improving or not. And this way you can basically move. So these are basically the architectural parameters issues. Now the second, the model parameters. And you have two sets of parameters, the weights and the biases. And this you can figure out only by backpropagation and gradient descent. Okay. So for these, people typically use mini batch gradient descent. Batch size, again, you have to figure out, okay, what should be the optimal batch size for your application, and it depends on how you want to do it and so on. Now, third important component when you are designing that you have to choose is called activation function. And there are many activation functions. The older one is called sigmoid function. The newer versions are basically ReLU function, rectified linear unit. People also use tanh function, but ReLU function is much more widely used nowadays than the other functions nowadays. So typically, depending upon the applications, you have to choose which one you want to take. Okay, so typically ReLU functions are used in the middle layers, and sigmoid functions are typically used in the final layers. That's the general guidelines that people follow. Okay, now another component that you have to figure out is the error or loss function. There are many kinds of error function, and I have mentioned here too the squared error and the cross entropy loss. Okay, I haven't put the formula deliberately yet because these are very standard things. You can figure it out. So there are other loss like hinge loss and this loss and Weaver loss and so on and so forth. So depending upon the application, you can, but typically the squared error and the cross entropy loss are typically common that you basically use. And finally, and the most importantly, the overfitting problem. And this is the most critical component, okay, where people often make the mistakes. So overfitting is the problem where your model is doing very good on training or seen data, the data that your model has seen, but very poor on test or unseen data. So when your model is doing very poorly on the test or unseen data, but very good on training data, you know your model overfitted. And this is the most critical component in training neural network. So there are many strategies, and I have pointed out 3 strategies for overfitting. One of the important strategies is called n-fold cross validation, where you don't want to simply train once and test once. What you want to do, you want to split the training data into n folds, use n-1 folds for training, and the other fold for testing, and then you simply repeat this by considering every fold as a test fold. Okay. Second component is called L2 regularization. So here what you do, you modify your error function a little bit. Now remember that all along I have been telling you that you had error function f error, but now I have added one more term, the square term. So f error plus alpha into sum of squares of all the parameters, wij's and bi's. So this is called L2 regularization term. So if you simply add this term, so it will probably fight the overfitting problem. But the most popular one nowadays is called dropout. Okay. So what does dropout do? While you are training the neural network, you can randomly choose some neurons or nodes in your network and simply drop them out while you are training. Okay. Now, if you look at this particular picture carefully, this is your original network. Okay. And this is your dropout network. So you have chosen this particular nodes randomly. Okay. And then drop them out from this network. So if you drop them out, then probably your network will try to overcome the overfitting problem that you encounter during training. So these are some of the problems. There are other strategies that people typically use for overfitting, but be very careful that this is one of the most critical and important problem while you are training deep neural network. Okay. So I will stop here, and if you have any questions, let me know. I will try to answer.
Hello.
Yes, please.
Sir, I have a very small question. This is during this overfitting. Can we say in this way that the related parameters which are associated with the function to overcome the problem of overfitting, can we regulate those parameters? Means actually I want to say that how you have handled the overfitting problem. If anyone asks me, then can I say that I have regulated the parameters which are associated with the function? Can we say in this way?
Yeah, yes. In fact, one of the problem in overfitting and known phenomenon is called when if the values of these parameters, the magnitude rather, okay, be it positive or be it negative, if the magnitude of some of the parameters are very, very high, for example, very high negative value or very high positive value, then that is one of the known problem for overfitting. So you are right. So when I have added this term in the error function, a square term, so basically the objective is to regulate these values of these parameters. I don't want to make it too large. Okay, be it negative or be it positive.
Okay, so okay. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Okay, any other question?
Sir, there is one question in chat box.
Oh, one question. Okay, all right. I will take a look. Okay, chat box. Okay. So again, see, I want to be very honest with you. There is no such guidelines. Okay, when one should use the loss function, which loss function, and so on and so forth. But I can tell you the more recent practice, which is basically the cross entropy loss. People generally prefer over this one. Okay, so I tell you the general sort of the consideration in this case. So when you have a very smooth sort of kind of function, okay, compared to like very rough function where slight change in the parameters will basically change the function too little, then you will prefer, for example, the cross entropy loss. Okay, so it depends on how smooth the values that you want to get, the functional values. Okay, I have one more question. Okay, the previous question was about choosing the error and loss function. And now I have one more question I have received. It's called vanishing gradient problem. and how that can be solved. Okay, that's an interesting question actually about well-known problem. So vanishing gradient problem is this. So see, you are computing these gradients using backpropagation, right? And the gradient, as you have seen, involved multiplication of many partial derivatives. Okay, so if there are many partial derivatives which are less than 1, then multiplication of too many 1 values will give very small value. So as a result, your gradient will become very close to 0 or sometimes 0. Okay, so as a result, there won't be any change in the parameter values even if you update it. So this is called the vanishing gradient problem. And this problem is well known, and it depends on the particular type of activation function that you use. And this is well known problem for sigmoid functions, because sigmoid function has a very small derivative, so this can be problematic. So that is why people prefer today the ReLU function, rectified linear unit function. So for ReLU, if the input value is non-negative or rather positive, then the gradient is always 1. Okay, it doesn't depend on the input value. And if it is negative or non-negative, non-positive, then the gradient is 0. Okay, so as a result, you do not have this vanishing gradient problem. So it depends on, I mean, ReLU function is one of the well-known solution for this. Okay, any other question? Yes, I will share the slides. One posted that, materials. Yes, I will share the slides that I presented.
So one more question is there on chat box, that
Yes.
what is vanishing gradient problem? It's in chat box.
Yeah, I have
Madhavi-
just responded. Vanishing gradient is this, that when the gradient or the derivative of a particular parameter, function of error function with respect to some particular parameter is 0 or close to 0. Okay, then it is basically a vanishing gradient problem. So when the gradient becomes very close to 0 or even 0, then you do not update this. You won't be able to update the value, right? That's called vanishing gradient problem. Yeah. Somebody has suggested the leaky ReLU may be used. Yes, absolutely. Yes, leaky ReLU is even better than normal ReLU. Right. Just to fight this, gradient, vanishing gradient problem. Okay. Other question? Okay. All right. I don't think there is any other question. So, so we can stop.
Yes, sir. I think, sir, we can conclude here.
Okay.
Thank you, sir, for your wonderful presentation. Madam, I think she will conclude. She is already online. Madam.
Thank you, sir, for your wonderful lecture. The informations which you gave, most of them, I think they are working also. That's why many questions came. And if further they are having any questions, they'll mail back you. Thank you, sir, for the lecture.
Okay. Thank you very much.
So,
Thank you very much.
thank
Okay.
you, sir.
Okay. See you again tomorrow morning. Yeah. Okay.